In this preacher's pseudoscience sermon so far, he said he likes the science that he constantly condemns, and that evolution isn't part of science. He says that evolution is a lie, and that there's no evidence to back it up, despite the fact that there is literally tons of it. And then, after telling all of those fibs with children in the audience, he then said that he was against lying to children. And in the very next breath after that, he said that the Big Bang didn't happen, and there's never been a caveman, and the Earth is not billions of years old, and that dinosaurs didn't exist millions of years ago, despite all the evidence in support of all of those things. And then he said that all the facts are just lies instead of the lies he told about them. That was just in the intro to this series. In the first episode alone, he said he's not trying to get evolution out of the public schools, but he also explained exactly how he really does intend to do that. And he said he doesn't want to get creationism into the schools, he just wants the schools to teach that all our geologic strata was caused by the God of creation. Then he said that Grand Canyon was not made by the Colorado River over millions of years, despite all the evident facts of the matter, including his own citations. In the second episode, he accused all the experts of being willfully ignorant about the subjects they specialize in, but that he's never studied, and he said that scientists think we came from rocks, when no one ever taught that, and the only people who really believe that, ironically, are creationists, who like to pretend that they're magically animated mud golems. He said that before James Hutton came along, everyone believes that the Earth was only a few thousand years old. Well, we know of a few who believe that the Earth was billions of years old, if not eternal. And he said that scientists came up with the numbers for the ages of the geologic strata before the invention of radiometric dating, which is where those numbers really came from. And he said that the geologic column doesn't even exist while showing photographs of it. In the third episode, he said that there was no fossil soil or erosion marks between geologic layers, and then he claimed to have stumped a fictitious geology teacher who didn't know anything about geology. And the preacher said that he likes to study geology himself, which he's obviously never done. Instead, he just declares that every fact is a lie, which is a lie in itself. For example, in the fourth episode, he said,
"The oldest layers are not obviously the oldest."
He tried to say that the textbooks lied by saying that coelacanths are all dead. But science has known about surviving coelacanths for 83 years already, since way back in 1938. So no textbooks have said otherwise for a lifetime. And then he tried to pretend that trilobites are still alive by saying that roaches and crustaceans are both trilobites, and that trilobites are not index fossils, and neither are dinosaurs. Both of them are, but his arguments are based on misunderstood studies and misrepresented fossils, and he's continuing those same claims in this episode too.
There's fossilized human hands found in the same rock strata as dinosaur bones.
The preacher mentions this only briefly, but I have to talk about it for a minute. His slide says that this rock was found near a large ichthyosaur, which he calls a marine dinosaur. Actually, ichthyosaurs are not dinosaurs, but the preacher, who calls himself Dr. Dino, doesn't know what a dinosaur is. He even runs a wannabe amusement park called Dinosaur Adventureland. Ever been to one of those roadside ripoffs to see The Thing? It's like that, but religious. The reptile family tree has a deep fork between two main branches. Crocodilomorphs, phytosaurs, pterosaurs, and dinosaurs, including birds, are on the archosaur side, while ichthyosaurs are on the lepidosaur side, along with placodonts and plesiosaurs, mosasaurs, ranchocephalians, lizards, and snakes. But Dr. Dino calls them all dinosaurs because he doesn't know anything about taxonomy. Second, when you look up the reference he gives, you'll find this website that says that scientists claim 130 million year old fossil is human. Except that Jaime Gutierrez, the guy who is actually claiming that, is not a scientist of any kind. He found the fossils, but he's not a paleontologist. He's a Colombian furniture designer and a creationist. But it gets funnier than that, because when you scroll down this article, you'll see this highlighted snippet.
When I announced the discovery in 1999, two professors, Dr. Hovind and Dr. Bao from Texas, appealed to date the stone. They came to Colombia and I signed the fossil to them. They still have it.
Remember that it's not possible to date a fossil all by itself. You have to radiometrically date the strata that it came from based on its relationship with igneous layers above or below it. And you can't know anything about that if all you have is the fossil itself. And both of these professors should have known that. And not like they were really going to date it anyway, since they just want to pretend that no fossil can be older than 5,000 years. So who are these professors, Hovind and Bao, PhD? Well, One of them, of course, is our own Dr. Dino, who doesn't know what a dinosaur is or how geology works. He bought his PhD through a mail-order correspondence course from an unaccredited diploma mill, which means that his degree is fake. It's supposed to be a doctorate in education, but he doesn't have an education. He doesn't have the normal prerequisites like a relevant master's degree or even a bachelor's degree, because he never went to an accredited college, if he went to a college at all. So he calls himself doctor, but he's not a doctor. He's a charlatan, someone who only pretends to be a doctor. And likewise, Dr. Carl Baugh runs a young Earth creationist museum in Glen Rose, Texas, home of the Paluxy River Mantrack hoax that we talked about last episode. In fact, he has a couple of those fake fossils in his museum where he still promotes them as genuine, even though everyone knows better by now. Carl Baugh also calls himself doctor, claiming 3 PhDs, although one was only an honorary degree given by an unaccredited school that he never actually attended. So that one's obviously imaginary. Another of his claimed PhDs was from a school that didn't even offer the degree that he claimed to have gotten from them. So when he was called out on that, he said he got it from an extension of that school on the other side of the world, in Australia, where he thought no one would check into it. But they did, and that extension never existed. So that degree is a lie too. His third doctorate was from another unaccredited school, which means it can't give legitimate degrees. And he should have known that, since he was the president of that school when he gave his degree to himself. So it's no surprise that these professors lying about their doctorates have been called out as frauds, even by other young Earth creationists. In fact, Dr. Dino spent about a decade in federal prison when he was convicted of 58 counts of 3 different types of fraud. So we have good reason not to believe their claims about these fossilized human hands found in the same strata as dinosaurs. Mr. Carl Baugh has already admitted that these fossil hands are not really human. They almost do look a bit like human hands until you see what they came from, because several scientists have actually studied this, including expert specialists who have positively identified these as the hands, or rather flippers, of a prehistoric sea turtle. It's supposed to be from 130 million years ago, and Gutierrez accepts that date because he's an old Earth creationist. But how does he know how old it is? When he gave it to a pair of young Earth creationists to date, knowing that they could not, and that they were not even going to try.
Now, they tell you the layers are different ages. That's simply baloney, okay? Now, Charlie Darwin didn't like round numbers, so he said the Wealdian deposits are 306,662,400 years old. How could he possibly know such a thing, okay?
Without the absolute dates provided by radioisotopes, there's no way Darwin could have known that. That's why he said it's only an estimate based on his assumption that it would take twice as long to erode a 1,000-foot cliff as one that it was only half as high. He failed to take into account other factors like undercutting, hardness of strata, and other particulars, but he admitted that it was just an estimate intended to give some crude notion of time, and he admitted that in all probability a far longer period than 300 million years has elapsed since the latter part of the secondary period that he was talking about at that moment.
All over the world, petrified trees are found standing up, connecting these different rock layers. Petrified trees standing up. Now, how long does a dead tree stand up around here before it falls down? 5 years, maybe 10 years? 5 million? Oh, no, not 5 million, that's for sure, right? But yet petrified trees in the vertical position are found all over the planet. I'll just flash through some pictures real quick here. There are all kinds of petrified trees found standing up. And they're running through multiple layers, and the kids are being taught the layers are different ages, and yet here's one tree connecting them all. I'm having a hard time believing these layers are different ages. That's what I'm having.
Remember how all of this preacher's arguments are decades out of date, sometimes being disproved even before he made them? Now, this argument was already disproved decades before he was even born. It might appear by the copyright that this claim was debunked only a quarter century ago, but it was actually debunked a century and a half ago in the very first science article ever describing this phenomenon. A polystrate tree is here demonstrated by a lycopod. These plants are related to today's club mosses, and some of them do look like little teeny evergreen trees, but they are very different. And this is an extinct species that used to grow to 30 meters high, or 100 feet tall in the Carboniferous period. Some Carboniferous lycopods were as much as 50 meters high, as tall as the original Godzilla in 1954. This one has roots that have grown through what is now solidly compressed rock, but was obviously soft soil at that time, and it evidently grew near a river system, as nearly all of these upright fossils do, in which there were seasonal floods, creating numerous thin layers around the base of this plant while it continued to grow. As you can see by the illustration, this tree grew through 3 noticeably different depositional environments, implying changing conditions, where some periods were drier or wetter than others. And these type fossils can also be found with occasional deposits of volcanic ash or arid dust being blown in between recurrent periods of seasonal inundation. So it doesn't and can't come from one huge flood. Because there are different layers of mud and silt being washed up wet and drying before the next seasonal layer comes, all while the tree is still growing there to the point it becomes this wide, we know that this could not have happened in just 1 year. You can't grow a plant this big in just 1 year. This took many years. Just the layers around the base of it took many years, perhaps several decades, of alternating wet and dry depositions that can't have happened in one flood, not even a really long flood. Then when the tree died, the exposed part rotted and fell over, maybe becoming part of the surrounding coal seam, while this part was protected from erosion and got buried under further strata, implying 4 things. This took a really long time, it happened a long time ago, and it didn't happen all at once. And while many small floods are intermittently accumulating here as the tree continues to grow, it could not have grown to this level of maturity with these layers during a single giant global flood.
Central Alabama's got a large coal mine with a whole bunch of petrified trees standing up running through 2 seams of coal, the Blue Creek and the Mary Lee. Now they're going to tell you in school, for coal to form, a forest has to grow, and then it all falls over and turns into a swamp, and then it gets buried, and then new mud washes in on top, and the coal slowly forms from the forest that was buried. And then thousands of years later, another forest grows on top, and a whole new layer of coal formed. So if you find 2 layers of coal, oh, that took thousands of years. That's what they'll tell you in school. That's simply baloney. We'll cover more on coal formation on video 6, but if you look at the samples of trees found in this coal mine, you look at sample A, B, C, D, E, F, G, I mean, any freshman law student could tell you, hey folks, I think I can prove these 2 coal formations formed at the same time, very quickly. Within a few weeks or months of each other, that's for sure. Probably during the flood in the days of Noah.
There was no days of Noah. Noah is a fictional character who was apparently loosely based on a number of Mesopotamian myths that all seem to stem from one original tale about a cattle herder named Ziusudra, whose barge got washed into the Persian Gulf when the Euphrates River overflowed its banks 5,000 years ago. That's according to archaeologists, of course, and most of this discussion is about geology. So why would we ask a freshman law student about any of this? Even if he was a law professor, he wouldn't say the things that were just predicted. He might not know that we already know how coal seams really formed. Some trees grow near rivers and other waterways. Some grow in them, in swamps and marshes. Which reminds me, I built a 2,000-gallon pond in my backyard, which was quite lovely for a long time until a huge tree fell over on it. It was originally a 1,500-gallon pond, but after the first year I drained it and cleaned it, removed the concrete foundation to dig it out even bigger, and I filled several wheelbarrows full of organic material out of that pond. I had koi and other fish in there, and they produce organic material. And every year, autumn leaves also contribute to that organic sludge at the bottom, and so does everything else that dies and sinks down there. So let's say that this swampy area eventually dries up, gets buried in wind-blown dust, and the thick deposit of pond scum starts the process of becoming fossil fuel. But the trees, at least some of them, might live through all of that. You still have rain. There's still a water table even if there's not enough for a river. And when these trees eventually die, they might be 150 feet high, but the first few meters of that can't fall over with the rest of it because they're now encased in what was once mud flows, now compacting into rock. Then that all gets filled in and buried too before the rivers eventually return and the whole process starts over again, but at a higher strata. Of course, conditions were a little different in the Carboniferous period, so named because that's where nearly all of our coal comes from. And what used to happen is that whenever a tree died and fell over, it would add to a pile of dead trees, and these would break down into smaller and smaller pieces, becoming peat and then lignite before finally being compressed into coal. So what changed all that some 300 million years ago? Scientists from the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory say there is evidence of the evolution of a fungi capable of digesting the polymer lignin, which, among other things, keeps plant cell walls rigid. So this fungus apparently ended widespread coal production.
In Cookeville, Tennessee. How far is Cookeville from here? 100 miles? What's that? 150 miles. In Cookeville, Tennessee, there's a coal mine with petrified trees standing running. Here's coal at the bottom. The tree is coalified at the bottom, petrified in the middle, and coalified on top, where it went through a second coal seam. Same tree.
When I heard this, I thought that can't be right. So I looked into it. And I could not find any geological studies to verify it. Just a bunch of creationist propaganda sites parroting the same claim, with no way to show that it was ever real. Even the preacher's own illustrations failed to show one tree connecting two different coal seams. Instead, you see broad fossilized trunks, which would count for no more than 1/5 of the total height of the living tree, with multiple layers of different types of deposits above them, before we see brand new growth beginning again in the later generation, now much higher in the strata. And that second generation is rooted to the ground, growing to mature girth before the whole process begins again. Wherever the preacher got his illustrations, they don't show what he wants to make you believe, but his audience doesn't recognize that because he's convinced them that they're seeing something else. So I turned to Stephen Bauman, author of How We Know What We Know About Geology. He said this wasn't his area, but that he had never heard of such a thing as a polystrate tree running through two different coal seams. So I knew I had to talk to someone with more direct experience. As this tree is reportedly in or around Cookeville, which is right in the middle of the state of Tennessee, I reached out to paleontologists at Middle Tennessee University, as well as Vanderbilt University in Nashville and the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. The responses I got were the same. Not even the local experts had ever heard of an upright fossil running through two different coal seams, and they said that the picture I provided was no help at all. So I was advised to contact coal geologist Professor Stephen Greb with the University of Kentucky. No one knew anything about one tree growing through two coal seams until I finally talked to somebody who specializes in exactly this field of expertise. So I have to be honest and publicly admit that where I originally thought that this was just another of the many lies of religious apologists, Dr. Greb explained that I was right, of course, and that he'd never heard of such a thing either, nor was it even possible. He said, Dr. Greb said that such a thing wouldn't even make any sense. He said he couldn't even imagine a scenario where a single tree could grow up through another swamp, a second layer of coal. He explained that the trees running through coal seams are usually not actually trees. They're lycopods, essentially gigantic prehistoric weeds, such as we've never seen alive in modern times. And they're not made of wood. Their stems are hollow, just like weeds. So these fossils are really the casts of the inside of the weed, and it's not possible for a stone cast to coalify. And he said that even if it wasn't a cast, even if it was an actual tree, it's still not possible for one tree to be both petrified and coalified. It may be hard for some of you to believe, but it seems as if the convicted fraud, falsely claiming lies in the textbooks, is telling stories again. How many of you still believe him? And if you do you have enough money to invest in offshore real estate that I have for sale?
By the way, why are coal seams generally found on top of layers of rock or clay? Wouldn't it be a pretty poor place to grow a forest? Ought to be on top of soil, don't you think? Yeah.
It is soil, or it was then, until more layers bury it and compress it under many tons of pressure for innumerable centuries. Then it becomes rock, or clay, and most of the soil in my neighborhood is clay already.
Polystrate fossils are found all over the world. In Joggins, Nova Scotia, there are dozens of petrified trees standing up, connecting different rock layers. Scientists go up there and look at them and just say, wow, that's curious. No, it's more than curious. It's devastating to your teaching that the layers are different ages.
Not if you know what you're talking about. Not if you know any of the staggering amount of scientific data behind this that goes far beyond some amateur assumptions on first sight. I could explain it myself, but my friend Paulogia lives in that area, and he's already explained it with illustrations. Here's what he said.
The accumulation of sand, volcanic ash, or vegetation obviously varies from location to location and year to year, depending on weather, natural disasters, and other factors, even within one small area. So how does that 150-year-old book account for the first and most famous of these so-called polystrate fossils? It tells us that the layer of coal under the rooted fossil was made from several feet of vegetable matter, probably in the form of peaty soil. In that soil grew a tree, where it lived about 150 years to attain its 12-inch diameter. The tree died and began to decay. As it did, its base became covered by about 18 inches of sediment. On this layer, other trees began to grow to a diameter of about 4 inches, as evident in the fossil record. These plants were in turn embedded by a coarser sediment, gradually enough to allow other plants to start up, with the mud and sand eventually attaining a depth of 9 feet. At that point, the hollowed-out rotting top of the tree was easily broken off by something, as indicated by the non-jagged top. This shearing is a common feature in upright fossils. The exposed hollow hole in the log was subsequently filled with sand, water, and animals, according to the findings inside. This additional material helped strengthen the tree's form for preservation. One of the area's familiar swamps formed next, as indicated by the type of coal layer covering our tree. Apply pressure, mineralization, and plenty of time, and that storied piece of Canadian earth was preserved to be read as plainly in 1868 as it is today. The majority of the world's upright fossils happen to be found in this part of Nova Scotia, though specimens have been spotted elsewhere in the world. Such fossils are found nearly exclusively in volcanic regions which provide sudden lava flow for coverage, or areas like Joggins that are marshy and subject to rapid flooding for quick deposits.
There's a brochure you can get from our bookstore. It's $2. It's got 30-some pictures of color pictures of petrified trees in the vertical position. Occasionally, the petrified trees are found upside down, running through many rock layers. Now we really got a problem.
No, we don't have a problem at all. The preacher does. We can find fossil trees in any position when they're deposited by local flash floods and so on, but those don't grow through multiple strata, obviously. I wasn't able to find a single geological or stratigraphic reference to any polystrate trees that were upside down. All I could find was a website by a Christian saying that he too couldn't find any reference to an actual upside down polystrate tree except in unreferenced claims in creationist literature. If you know something I don't, he said, please let us know through the Contact Me link or the comment section below. And I will extend that same invitation here too, to the comment section of this video.
I've thought about this till my brain hurts. The evolutionists have two ways to solve this. They can say, well, Hovind, you know, the trees stood upright for millions of years while the layers formed around them. Or the trees grew through hundreds of feet of solid rock looking for sunlight. There's a third way to look at it. You know, maybe they were all buried in a big flood. How fast was that calf going? Keep that thought in mind, okay?
The preacher wants you to think that there are two interpretations here, but there is only one, and that one is not on his list. Until now, we've been talking about polystrate trees growing in or on the edge of river systems rather than in a giant flood. But there is another type of polystrate tree that we have to talk about. This area is Specimen Ridge in Yellowstone National Park, the site known for a vast collection of upright fossils, which not only cannot be explained by flood geology, but this formation singularly disproves the global flood all by itself. Now here's how I explained that in my video on how dendrochronology disproves Noah's flood. Here we find evidence of 27 forests. Not 27 trees, 27 forests preserved in volcanic sediment, with each forest being buried on top of another. How is this possible? Observing present-day volcanoes and their effect on the environment, now we can make sense of this. Starting with the first, and Consequence, the bottommost forest, we find a volcano erupting in what was called the Eocene epoch. The animals flee this eruption, thus leaving very few of their fossils, but the trees, unable to do anything but stand firmly in their spots, are buried by the volcanic eruption. However, they're not completely buried. Any trunks or branches not covered in ash will rot, preserving only the parts that are covered. The volcanic dust also preserved in its layers leaves, twigs from conifers, deciduous trees, and ferns. Igneous rock takes about 200 years to decay into soil suitable to to support large forests again, following the last volcanic eruption until the next one. At Specimen Ridge, this process has repeated itself 27 times. So if we count only the period between the destruction and reformation of fertile soil, that alone brings us to an age of 5,400 years, still within the creationist timescale. We need more than just rotting volcanic rock to date this forest, and serendipitously, these trees still have their growth rings. Using dendrochronology, we can see that the oldest trees in each of the 27 forests in this geologic stack is around 500 years old. 27 such generations gives us an age of about 13,500 years. Then we must add in the amount of time that it takes to start growing such old forests, 200 years between each cycle for new soil. That gives us an age of 700 years for each layer of forest that we see. Multiply this by the 27 layers, and this formation must be, at minimum, 18,900 years old. Why minimum? Because it's possible that volcanic rock took longer to become soil, or growing conditions might not always be suitable at the 200-year decay range to start supporting a new forest. And these trees might max out at 500 years, so that some of them might already be dead by the next eruption. And that's if we completely ignore all of the radiometric dating methods used to confirm that this repetitious cycle began in the Eocene epoch 55 million years ago. You don't just throw out the facts every time they dispute your favorite storybook. You throw out the man-made mythology when you see that it's wrong. So how do we know these forests are stacked on top of each other and not simply buried in one fell swoop with roots somewhat attached? Simple. Complete root systems have been found directly attached to the trunks of many of these trees. Even better, they show no signs of having been broken off the roots in any manner. But couldn't the flood have dragged the dirt with these tree roots, thusly causing them to still stand upright because the weight would cause them to sink root first? Not really. Again, we look at modern times to figure out how the past behaved. In today's modern floods, which have also torn up trees by their roots, this weighted sinking did not occur. Instead, the trees were deposited laying on their sides, with most of their roots stripped away. In this Yellowstone fossil formation, there is a 12-foot tall, 26.5-foot round fossil redwood that has roots as large as that of any modern tree, but they're embedded in solid rock. Nearby this redwood are 2 pine trees, each about 15 feet tall and showing complete root systems. In order to demonstrate an individual layer, we need to have root systems immediately connected to the tree trunk. That is exactly what we would see today. And sure enough, we have the top of a trunk that is eroded away thanks to rot directly below the roots of another tree. There is a hypothesis, to be inappropriately kind, among creationists that after the flood, things grew rapidly to fill up the earth again to the life scale that we see today. Presumably life slowed down once it reached anything that humans would recognize as being particularly old. If this is the case, we can predict that we will see evidence of all ancient trees correlating tree rings, that they would have all started growth in the same year, and that we could predict that they would show giant growth rings toward the middle of these. Yet again, creationist predictions fall short. Still staying at Specimen Ridge, we see that the trees there have rings of varying size. This tells us the rainfall varied from year to year then, just as it does today. As mentioned before, dendrochronologists have used these tree rings to date the oldest trees in their formation to 500 years. Remember that this is per layered forest. If indeed all the trees in this entire formation died in the same year, we would expect the rings to be identical. However, this is not the case. If the flood supporters were correct, then we would see giant growth rings as mentioned before. Again, the claim is not supported by the evidence. There is also a suspicious lack of aquatic species in this formation. If indeed it was a great worldwide flood, we would expect there to be some fish mixed in with these forest deposits. So there you have it. Proof that geologic layers are different ages and that polystrate trees are not caused by and cannot be explained by biblical flood geology.
Mount St. Helens blew thousands of trees into Spirit Lake. Lots of those trees are stuck in the mud at the bottom of Spirit Lake. They're going to petrify in the standing position.
No, they really won't, because the roots won't allow it if there were any roots left. Instead, all these trees would lay on their sides. But even if there was a few that were upright, they won't be rooted into the ground beneath them like all of the upright standing fossil trees are.
It doesn't take long for things to petrify. Here's petrified firewood. The guy chopped on it before it turned to stone.
What utter fiction! The guy chopped on it? What guy? There was no guy who ever chopped on this before it turned to stone. The citation says it came from the petrified forest. So the first time anyone saw this firewood, it was already lithified. The mineral of fossilization in that area of Arizona is quartz. All the fossil trees in the petrified forest are made entirely of quartz. Solid, unbending stone, not elastic at all, but brittle under pressure. When these fossils are uplifted, exposed, and otherwise eroded, they break, not the way trees break, but the way quartz breaks, either snapping in half or with chunks snapping off, both in ways that look like they were chopped. There was no guy who chopped that wood and then it turned to stone. Not even if it was the same guy who planted that tree using magic beans before he himself turned into a pumpkin.
There's a mummified dog stuck in a tree, turned to stone. It chased a coon up the tree apparently and got stuck. They named it Stucky. What would you call it, okay?
Everything this preacher says is factually false and deliberately deceptive. The dog didn't turn to stone. It was mummified, not petrified. The dog died in a tree at some height off the ground. That kept its body dry, and the smell was carried out through the tree like a chimney, so that bugs and such couldn't find it to decompose it. The tannic acid in the oak hardened its skin, but it didn't turn to rock. But then, remember that this is the preacher who pretends to study geology and doesn't know what a rock is.
There's a petrified cowboy boot with the cowboy's legs still in it. The boot was made in 1950, and the leg is turned to stone.
This is another one of Carl Bau's collection of frauds and hoaxes, though it's not on display anymore. Once dubbed the Limestone Cowboy, it is a real boot that was found in another Texas riverbed, and it is full of concretion rather than bone. There does seem to be a piece of bone included in it, but we don't know if it's fossilized bone or how fossilized or if it's even human bone, because Mr. Carl Bau won't let any scientists examine this artifact. If you want to read more about that, I'll put a link to an article by Glen Kuban, who specializes in investigating these sorts of frauds and hoaxes in that area. Kuban says that it's more likely a bit of unfossilized bone stuck in concretion, but we may never know, because after much inquiry from scientific investigators, Bau simply hid the artifact away and stopped talking about it, rather than let anyone prove that it's just another of his hoaxes.
Here's petrified fish giving birth.
That is not a fish. That is an ichthyosaur. Just think what it would look like if you made a dolphin out of a reptile, because that's what this is. They were common in the Jurassic period. And remember that earlier in this episode, Dr. Dino said that an ichthyosaur is a marine dinosaur. But here, he says it's just a fish. Does he not know the difference? Or does he think that fish can be dinosaurs too?
It does not take millions of years to give birth. Praise God, okay?
Ichthyosaurs gave live birth, and one of the risks of live birth is that it is a very traumatic experience and can sometimes kill the mother. In this case, both mother and child died in the birthing process, and their floating corpses were evidently washed onto the beach, or maybe they died on the beach already, and were quickly buried under the pounding surf.
There's a petrified hat. Petrified pickle found in a jar. The guy sent me the jar and pickle. He said, Brother Hovind, I found this in Montana in an old home. The house was junk. The roof was gone. The house was falling apart. But he said, you want a petrified pickle for your museum? I said, of course. Who in their right mind would not want a petrified pickle, you know? Come on down to Pensacola, Dinosaur Adventureland, and see the petrified pickle. Here's petrified sacks of flour found in a flour mill that flooded in 1910 in Eureka Springs, Arkansas. Here's petrified toadstool. There's an amazing gem and mineral museum just south of Bloomington, Illinois, in the little bitty tiny town called Shirley, Illinois. You got to be trying to find it to get there, but it's worth going to see the Funk Gem and Mineral Museum. Okay? Here's petrified acorns.
All of these claims are really the same thing. It's not petrification, it's concretion, where minerals in moving water attach to and build up on the outside of whatever happens to be there. So it's not turning to stone, it's just getting covered in bits of stone. And again, I could explain this myself, but I would never do it as well as Potholer 54 has already done. So let me show you how he explained that.
Here's another artifact, a crappy old hat. It might have some value as a hat if someone hadn't left it at the bottom of a flooded mine shaft in Tasmania, but after a century underwater, calcium carbonate has been precipitated into the pores and turned the hat rigid. Answers in Genesis isn't stupid enough to think this proves that biblical people travelled to Australia and wore 19th century style felt hats. It uses the hat as proof that fossilization can occur very rapidly. Okay, in that case, along with this fossil teddy bear, here's a fossilized bath, a fossilized sink, a fossilized faucet, and a fossilized pipe. Look, if you want to show that fossilization can occur relatively rapidly, just open a geology textbook. This has been known for years. But that doesn't mean all fossilization is rapid. It depends on the type of organic material and the type of mineral that's replacing it, along with a long list of other factors. Calcium carbonate can do the job relatively quickly, silica does it much more slowly. But none of the artifacts being shown here has been fossilized or petrified. These are just concretions. What makes me laugh is that archaeologists spend a lot of their time trying to get this crap off the artifacts they find, but creationist museums are spending thousands of dollars buying up old tools and bits of clothing because they've got this crap on them. The moral is that if you want to make some money, put a discarded shoe under a hard-water waterfall, come back in 10 years and sell it to your local creationist museum. Oh, and don't forget to tell them that you found it in a strata of rock that's supposed to be millions of years old. I know what you're thinking. Surely creationists now understand concretions. Surely none of them would be stupid enough to want a bit of old junk that can so easily be covered in crap. I wonder if some of them still might.
Mummified dog stuck in a tree. Here's a petrified hat. Petrified pickle. Here's petrified sacks of flour. Here's petrified toadstool. Here's petrified acorns. This kid sent them to me. He said, Brother Hovind, I was 7 years old at the time. He said, I stuck these acorns in a bucket of water, and I thought they might, sprout and make some trees, and I forgot about them. Next spring, my mama found the bucket on the back porch, and the acorns had turned to stone. He said, would you like them for your museum? So kids, when they tell you the layers are different ages, you tell them Kent Hovind said they're confused or they're lying. It is not correct. Those layers all formed, nearly all of them, at the time of Noah's flood.
So in this episode, we've seen more proof that geologic layers are definitely different ages. And once again, as always, we see that creationism depends entirely on frauds, falsehoods, and fallacies with no truth in it. Not one thing the preacher has said has been both true and indicative of his position. And now you know that he's not telling the truth, that what he says is wrong. The question is, does the truth matter to you? Or are you determined to keep believing even when you know it's not true?